Warning, the podcast you're about to listen to may contain graphic descriptions of violent acts and injury. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to the Murder Police Podcast.
Okay, Wendy, do you want to tell the listeners what we have in store for them today?
Yeah, this is going to be part one of a two-part series of the 2009 murder of Amanda Ross. Retired Lexington Police Sergeant Todd Iddings was the lead investigator, and he will take us through this domestic violence murder.
You're right, that's a domestic violence case. We haven't done one yet, and I think we will probably wind up doing more because they just tend to happen way too often. I personally investigated several of these when I was in homicide. And on some I was the lead and some I was on the support team part of it with the homicide unit. What's interesting about them is they're not typically the whodunits that we deal with a lot of the time. It may take some time to identify who the person is, but you'll hear in this case that it happened very rapidly because of some of the documentation that existed. The thing that I want to have the listeners pay attention to right now is this. These cases, like all other cases, are pretty graphic in nature. On a domestic violence case, it can be a lot more personal for a listener. So if you've been a victim, if you recognize you may be a victim now, or you know somebody that's been a victim, just listen to this cautiously and be aware of the fact that it could really bring up some emotions for a listener. That said, if you are a victim or know someone that's a victim, there are resources available. And the first thing to do is to call 911 or your local police or sheriff's department. On a national level, you can contact the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE. That's S-A-F-E. They also have a fantastic website with resources and to be able to make contact at, and that's at www.thehotline.org. A very safe website. You can actually scrub your information as you leave that website so nobody knows that you've been there. Some of the other things that Todd dealt with in this case was not only the fact it was a domestic violence case, it was a high-profile case. This has been covered on national television, and it's been covered in several national newspapers for some time. That's because the suspect was Steve Nunn. Now, he had political clout because he was the son of a former Kentucky governor named Louis Nunn, who was the 52nd governor of Kentucky in 1967. Steve himself had been in other relationships before. He had been married and divorced twice and actually had 3 children from a first marriage. His own political clout came from the fact that he was a state representative for the 23rd District in the Kentucky House from 1990 to 2006 and actually ran for governor in Kentucky in 2003. Pay attention to what this political clout means and the pressures it put on the investigation, and listen closely for an incredible irony that developed out of this. With that, let's get into the show.
Hi, Todd. Thanks so much for joining us today. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
David, how are you?
Doing real well. I'm just excited about getting this case together and getting it told because there's a lot of fantastic details on this thing.
Well, great. Well, with that being said, let's dig right into it. Todd, why don't you start with telling us a little bit about yourself?
My name's Todd Iddings. I was a police officer for 25 years. I worked in Ohio for 5 years in a little small town and then did 20 years with the Lexington Police Department. In that 20 years, I spent 14 years of my career assigned to various roles within the Bureau of Investigation. I started out in what was called the ROPE unit, then robbery homicide, the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force, Major Violator Unit, and then I spent the last 6.5 years of my career as a supervisor, as a sergeant over the Forensic Services Unit, which is the crime scene unit.
Man, that's a lot of variety. Step back a minute and tell me what ROPE stands for, where that was, and what you did.
Okay. It stands for Repeat Offender Prosecution and Enforcement. And basically the gist of this position with the police department is it's somewhat of a liaison role with the Commonwealth Attorney's Office. One of the things that position does is it conducts follow-up on cases. A police officer that gets a call or makes a felony arrest, they can do everything they can that day. But 3 weeks from now, when something new comes up or a defense attorney says, hey, we've got additional witness, that positions somebody to go out and do that follow-up. And really what it was kind of meant to do was shore up cases to make better prosecution, particularly in repeat offenders. In Kentucky, there's a law called a persistent felony offender, which enhances penalties the more felonies that you commit and are convicted of. So that's kind of the original reason that position was created.
So I guess you got a really strong working relationship with the Commonwealth Attorney in that time.
I did, yes.
Well, the next thing, too, is that Joint Terrorism Task Force that you mentioned. Tell us what you can about that you don't have to kill us when you're done.
So in the wake of the terror attacks on September 11th, 2001, the 10,000-foot view of terrorism in the United States was that there wasn't a very good effort between the FBI and before that wasn't even Homeland Security, like Customs and Border Enforcement and the CIA and local law enforcement. They created these joint terrorism task force all over the nation to have a codified effort in investigating terrorism cases. Actually, in Kentucky, there's actually 3 joint terrorism task forces. There's one in Northern Kentucky, one in Lexington, and then one in Louisville. It was a neat position, but I spent a couple years there and wanted to go do something else. So I ended up leaving there and coming back to be a regular detective at the police department.
Gotcha. And then finally, because this is really interesting, we have a lot of people that listen to this show that are big CSI fans and Forensic Files fans. To supervise that unit, what was that like? Because that's an incredibly busy place with a lot of high-skilled people in it.
You know, it was a pretty seamless fit for me. Even as a homicide detective, I was always kind of a scene guy. I always wanted to be on the scene and be working with the crime scene folks and kind of getting a feel for what they're seeing as I conduct investigations. As science and technology improve, the ability to use fingerprint science, DNA science, digital photography enhances the investigative efforts of the police department, enhances the abilities of the prosecutor's office to make a more effective prosecution. My folks were really good at fingerprints. I shouldn't say they still are fantastic at fingerprints. They get fingerprints that solve crimes all the time. And it's nuts, from everything from a car break-in to homicides. They get fingerprints and solve crimes.
That was my experience before I left, is that it seemed like for years that kind of went into a lull. And I think maybe sometimes we all got more interested in the high-tech stuff to where we almost forgot about fingerprints, but it was amazing what they were doing with that. The technology advances are incredible too, because when you're old murder police like me from back in the Stone Age, I remember touch DNA might as well have been George Jetson's car. It was something that they were talking about possibility-wise, and we were stuck with. We weren't even when I started in mitochondrial, so it's fantastic with those advances. Wendy, did you have something you were going to ask him?
No, I'm just thinking about your Stone Age, realizing that I'm sitting here with a husband that was archaic back in the day. But no, I agree. That's just amazing. And, I think a lot of people probably who watch this enjoy, I know I do, Forensic Files. I'm not necessarily a CSI fan, but I do like a lot of the true crime bios and this type thing. So yeah, very impressive, your history there. Why don't you lead us into this case and tell us, just before we dig into it, tell us a summary of who's the victim, the suspect, a little bit about this generalized case.
Okay. The victim in this case is a young lady by the name of Amanda Ross. She was 29 years old at the time of the homicide. The homicide occurred on September 11th, 2009 at approximately 6:34 a.m. The Lexington Police Department received a shots fired call at the Opera Square Townhomes, which is on West Short Street in downtown Lexington. They arrived at 2 minutes later, and they located Miss Ross lying in the parking lot in front of her townhome with multiple gunshot wounds. She was transported to the University of Kentucky Medical Center, where she was pronounced deceased. The scene is a townhome community, like 1 block from Rep Arena. It's a gated community. You either had to have a key or a code to get through the gates to get into it. Amanda's residence, her unit was number 35. And as you come in the main gate, it was in the back right corner, and it had kind of had its own little separate parking lot around the side of a building that was surrounded by, bushes, trees, vegetation, fences. Was somewhat dark that morning. So, as officers start talking to the callers and whatnot, they learn that basically folks heard gunshots, a female voice crying, pleading for help, and then more gunshots.
Yeah, before we dig down into the weeds with it too, because this is a good time to get to it. What about Amanda? Can you tell us about who she was and the circumstances in her life at that time?
Sure. So Amanda was currently employed at that time as a director with the Department of Insurance and with the Commonwealth of Kentucky in Frankfort. She was somewhat of a political animal and heavily involved with the Democratic Party of Kentucky. She was the daughter of Terrell and Diana Ross. Her father started a company called Ross Sinclair Associates, which is a public financier company. She was also involved with the Humane Society of Fayette County. I believe she was on their board. Her mother, Diana, her father had passed away. Her mother was still alive and lived just a couple blocks away from Amanda. And the morning of this crime, her mother was up walking the dog and walked by the townhome, saw the police cars and the crime scene tape and everything, and knew that in her heart that something had happened to Amanda.
Well, that's sad, and obviously that's where this story is going to go, for her to have that feeling and what led up to that too. So thanks for sharing that. We always like to get a little information on who the victim is, and probably to mention now too that today's date that we're recording this is actually her birthday, if I remember correctly.
That is, yes. She was born on October 10th, yes.
She would have been 41 today.
Yeah, what a way to commemorate that and keep her in our memories. Well, thanks for that background bio on her. And if you want to, go ahead and just take us on through the case.
Okay. I was the on-call detective for the homicide unit that morning, as well as the next step to catch a homicide. So kind of to explain how that unit works is you have a rotation for catching homicide cases. And I just happen to be next step for the next homicide case, as well as being the on-call detective. So the on-call detective gets called out for shootings, robberies, not necessarily homicides. I mean, at that time, I believe we were still investigated sex crimes, so we got called out for sex crime cases as well. I responded from home, and upon getting to the scene, kind of did a walkthrough with the scene with the initial patrol officers that got there, and the crime scene unit was already there. Forensic services was already there, starting to take photos and document the scene as it was. And so things I observed right off the bat were Amanda's car was still in the parking spot. Her car keys were sitting there. Her purse was sitting there. Her purse was partially opened, and I could see into the purse where I saw her wallet, a handgun, a couple, I believe it was an iPhone and a BlackBerry. So at that time, I kind of ruled out robbery as a motive because all those valuable things had been there. Officers did make entry into her townhome when they were able to identify her. They made entry to do a protective sweep of her townhome, make sure there was nothing in there. And there were observations in there. They didn't see anything out of place, didn't look like any signs of struggle. No windows broken, no doors broken, or anything like that. One of the things we do with victims, obviously, we have a record management system with the police department that we run a name query to see what kind of contact we'd had with them, as well as run them to get their driver's license information and whatnot. And the thing that popped up is that Amanda was a petitioner and had an active domestic violence order against an individual by the name of Steve Nunn. And what a domestic violence order is folks that are involved in a domestic relationship who have some violence in that relationship. They can petition the court to get a restraining order. And Amanda had done that and had an active restraining order against Steve Nunn. Obviously, our first thoughts were, who is Steve Nunn and where's he at? We need to talk to him. So we start researching Mr. Nunn. Some things we kind of knew. He was a recognizable name in the state of Kentucky. His father used to be governor. He was a former state representative. So some things were kind of on our radar with him. while we're kind of getting this rolling, our sergeant, or my sergeant of the homicide unit, received a phone call from a local attorney who happened to represent Mr. Nunn in the domestic violence case with Miss Ross, and kind of provided some information that Mr. Nunn's ex-wife had spoken with him yesterday. Some things just didn't seem right. And she got kind of an ominous text from him late the evening before. I reached out and made contact with her and got a statement from her. Basically, she, her and Mr. Nunn, even though they were divorced, maintained a very close relationship as friends. The domestic violence incident that led to the domestic violence order had really affected Mr. Nunn, in her opinion. And she felt the text message, she learned that there was an incident where he went to his daughter's and switched cars with one of his daughters the day before, that he'd been to a monument store, a tombstone retail establishment in Glasgow, Kentucky, and wanted to look at his tombstone or a sketch of his tombstone, and was very insistent on doing this, and had put his date of death on the tombstone. So she was concerned and contacted a couple of his friends who went to him and took him out to dinner and spent a couple hours with him. At the end of it, they felt that, they kind of cheered him up and everything was fine. And here in a little bit, I'll kind of explain a timeline that kind of led us to why some of these things happen. As I'm speaking to the ex-wife, I'm trying to figure out if I can find this guy. She thinks that if he's anywhere, he's either going to be at the old family farm or the cemetery where his father and mother are buried. But she really couldn't give me, she wasn't from that part of the state, so she couldn't give me specific of where I needed to send folks to. I ended up making contact with Mr. Nunn's estranged sister, who provided me the name of the farm and the location and the name of the cemetery and the location. This information was relayed to the state police, as well as the information about the daughter's car that he switched with the day before. And we also, at this point, kind of learned that he's been in contact with his daughters. I learned that from the estranged sister, because the estranged sister had been in contact with Mr. Nunn's first ex-wife, who is the mother of his daughters. So I'm also trying to make contact with the daughters and not being very successful. In 2009, we tried to ping his phone, which is basically contact the phone company, explain what's going on, and say, hey, can you give us a geographical location of the phone based on tower information? His wireless carrier at the time wasn't a very big wireless carrier, and the person that knew how to use that technology happened to be on vacation. So we kind of struck out on that aspect. But a short while later, the Kentucky State Police go to the Cosby Cemetery in Hart County, Kentucky, and this is where former Governor Louis Nunn and his wife Beulah Nunn are buried. And when they get to the cemetery, on the right side of the cemetery is a little church, and they find the daughter's car behind the church. So they start working their way through the cemetery, and when they get to the former governor's gravesite, find a empty pistol holster, a bloody knife, and a fanny pack. So they're kind of, senses are up, and as they're kind of working through the cemetery, the back of the cemetery goes down a little hill into a tree line, and they've got movement in the tree line. So they challenge the movement, and Mr. Nunn steps out of the tree line with a gun in his hand and points the gun to the side and fires a round off. Then he drops the gun, flops to the ground, and acts like he'd shot himself. He's covered in blood because he's cut his wrists, which is why the bloody knife's up by the gravesite. However, the medical records called the wounds superficial and indicated that he was on blood thinners. Really, the blood was more indicative of that than an actual effort to probably harm himself. At that point in time, he's taken into custody and transported to the Bowling Green Medical Center for treatment. I'm still in Lexington doing interviews by phone and were knocking out search warrants for the car and phone stuff and that kind of stuff when I'm notified by KSP that they found him and got have him in custody. My intention is to try to get to him and get a statement from him, but also get to the crime scene at the cemetery. We ended up leaving Lexington and driving to the Cosby Cemetery in Hart County. It was about a 2.5 hour drive. While we were trying to get there, Mr. Nunn's being treated at the Bowling Green Medical Center, and he's under guard by the Kentucky State Police. And there's a detective sergeant with the state police who is with Mr. Nunn watching him. And Mr. Nunn initiates a conversation with the sergeant with the state police. And so the sergeant goes ahead and engages him in conversation. And during this conversation, Mr. Nunn keeps discussing what the perceived wrongs that he had from Miss Ross and that he wanted revenge. And he would get himself, during the statement, he would get himself all keyed up, complaining about her and all this horrible stuff that, she has caused him. And then he would just say, I wanted revenge. And so the sergeant would do the thing that most cops would do and go, well, is that why you killed her? And he would immediately change the subject and they would talk about other things. And then he would come back up, get keyed up again. After I think maybe the second or third time, he said something about a lawyer. And it initially, they continued to talk. And then finally he actually did lawyer up and the statement ended at that time. So when I got down to Hart County to the cemetery, they had recovered a 5-shot Smith & Wesson 38 special, little snub-nosed 38 from Mr. Nunn. And when I went over to where the car was parked on the other side of the cemetery behind the church, a couple things kind of popped out to me as odd right off the bat. In Kentucky, on a regular license plate, the county that you live in or the car's registered in, is the county name is a little sticker on the bottom of the plate. Or for some reason, that sticker on this car was covered up with masking tape. The other thing that was interesting to me is the little dealership decal that was on the back bumper was covered up with black electrical tape.
Like he's already using a car that's not his own, which is kind of strange. And then you think that he's obscuring parts of those identifiable pieces of the car he's in.
Correct. One piece of evidence that we had in Lexington, the adjacent to the townhome complex in downtown Lexington was a elementary school called Harrison Elementary School, and the street that runs between the townhome complex and the school is called Bruce Street. We noticed that there were video surveillance cameras on the outside of the elementary school, and we're able to obtain the surveillance system from the school. We're at 6:37 a.m., 3 minutes after the call comes in, a small small dark colored passenger car is driving up Bruce Street, and this car had a spoiler on it, and the car we found at the Cosby Cemetery has a spoiler on it as well. So we at this point in time we can't say it's definitely a car, but it's certainly another little piece of circumstantial evidence in this case. In your previous podcast, the types of cases you had are what we would call whodunits. And this one we would call a dunker. We were fairly confident that Mr. Nunn had caused Amanda's death. So the other cases that you covered on here, it took investigators months and months and months to figure out who the perpetrators were. This one, right off the bat, we knew. However, there still was a ton of work to go into this case. Back to the cemetery, besides the stuff on the back of the car, on the front passenger seat was a manila envelope, a folding legal envelope. And on the outside of that envelope was the word psycho bitch file. Upon examination of that, there was this 7-page letter that was dated September 9th, 2009, where Mr. Nunn had basically laid out his manifesto and reasons that he needed revenge on Amanda Ross. He in the letter never actually admits to killing her, but it's all this history between the two of them and his view of their history, his attempts to get even with her that failed. It just left him at a point that he needed revenge. It also in that folder was a letter that was addressed to Amanda's mother that was like another 4 pages long. And it actually listed, probably at some point in time in their relationship, they discussed how many people that they had been with sexually. And so he has listed every person that Amanda has been involved with romantically. Like, I don't know the intent of it. I don't know why he did it. I don't know, why he would send that to her mother, but this was in that folder. So while we were still down in Hart County, the Barron County Sheriff reached out to me, and he actually rode in the ambulance with Nunn from the cemetery to the hospital. And Nunn kind of makes some statements to him in regards to, so he basically saying, hey, sorry I put you all through this. I should have been a better shot. I had a cheap gun, stuff like that just weren't real consistent with somebody that hadn't done something wrong. And then, the sheriff also tells me that they had recovered a box of Nunn's personal items from an individual in the town of Glasgow. So we swung by the sheriff's office to get that and learned that on the day before, Mr. Nunn had contacted one of his friends and said, hey, I need you to hang on to something for safekeeping. I'm probably going to go away for a while. And so this gentleman didn't really know what he was talking about or whatnot. He was actually at the country club and said, hey, just drop it off in the car's not sitting outside the club. Just drop it off. So Mr. Nunn puts it in the car. And this box contained a rather large amount of amateur pornography that Mr. Nunn had possessed, involving pretty much, it seemed, anybody that he had a romantic relationship with and got intimate with, he would take compromising photos of. Later, we learned that he liked, the country club late at night when they've all had some drinks, he liked cracking it out and showing it off to people in the bar and bragging about his prowess, I guess would be the best way to say it. At this time, I know who did it. I just can't prove it.
Let me jump into it because this is something that I think you see different in cases. You're dealing with a guy that's a high-profile individual. Would you agree? When you get a case and you start to see something that's going to definitely get the media's attention, maybe more than other cases, which can be sad because a lot of cases just don't get front page because it's not people that everybody knows. Does it feel different approaching that? What I'm saying is that do you worry about the fact that you're going to walk into this thing with a high-profile guy and now you've not only got him suspected probably in a murder, but bizarre behavior? And is there a different approach to that case? Does it affect you differently? Or tell me a little bit about that.
Me personally, no. However, from my supervision, from the police department administration, from City Hall, from the Commonwealth Attorney's Office, yes, they were all spun up because, and the reason it didn't affect me, when you do investigations, you do the same thing every time. You make the same case. You're just as thorough and diligent on every case. To me, this case, I didn't care that the suspect in it was somebody of prominence or that the victim was somebody of prominence. It was another victim to me, and it was just another suspect. So my approach didn't change. I had a lot more scrutiny and oversight than I typically did on it. But, ultimately, in the end, it didn't really affect me much because I still did my job.
I think also looking at some of the notes of this case and listening to what you said about his folder that contained a letter, almost a letter sounding like he was justifying why he was about to do what he was about to do 2 days after you found it. There had been previous domestic violence episodes between these two.
Correct.
Right?
Correct. So at this point in time, I don't have enough to charge Mr. Nunn. So my thought process is I've got to figure out a way to establish probable cause. I have a saying I always use in investigations, what I know and what I can prove. At this point in time, I felt pretty confident that he was in fact the person who murdered Amanda Ross. However, I don't think I could prove it at this point in time. So the state police end up taking him into custody and placing charges on him in discharging the firearm in close proximity to them. It's a charge called wanton endangerment in Kentucky. So they end up taking him into custody for that to kind of give me a little bit of time to work. One of the first things that I did was I took the gun, and I get back from Barron County in the Glasgow area like 3 a.m. And so I have all this evidence from down there that I got to take to the police department and secure, because it's evidence. It's got to be secured. I can't just take it home or leave it in my trunk. I take it to the police department and secure it. And then I get up the next morning and start making phone calls and end up getting the firearms examiner for the Kentucky State Police to do me a solid and come in on a Saturday, take a look at this gun. Because by this time, Amanda had been to the medical examiner's office and an autopsy had been completed on her. She was shot once in the torso and twice in the head. And I had projectiles recovered from autopsy that I wanted to compare to the gun that KSP found Mr. Nunn with. I sweet talked this firearms examiner who graciously came in on his day off and spent about 6 hours with me at the lab doing a forensic analysis on the guns to the projectiles. In the end, it was an inconclusive decision. Basically, there were when you're looking at scientific evidence such as firearms, you're looking at, it's basically tool mark evidence, and they're looking for points of minutia that they can match up from as a characteristic from the inside of the barrel to the projectile that came out of the victim. They had some similarities on several, but they just couldn't get to a point where they felt comfortable saying that it was the firearm. The only thing that was of comfort to me was the projectiles removed from Miss Ross at autopsy were 38 special, and Mr. Nunn was in possession of a 38 special at time of arrest. Now,
can I, for our forensic people out there, CSI people, let's talk about this, and you'll understand what I'm about to ask. Did you find shell casings back at the scene of the shooting?
I did not, and it's because he had a revolver.
Right.
So the shell casings were still in the revolver. I had witness statements from the townhomes that thought they heard 3 to 4 shots, and then when he fired a shot down there were 5 empty shell casings in the revolver. So he basically shot all his rounds out in the course of from killing Amanda to being apprehended by the state police. So there were no shell casings. Just because the gun was inconclusive doesn't mean that it wasn't the gun. And it didn't really give me probable cause. However, it was just another little piece. I mean, this case was all built on circumstances. I never really had any good direct evidence. It was a whole lot of putting the little pieces together to make this case. Basically, without the firearm, I just stay working on it. I'm interviewing people, making phone calls. And so Monday morning, the first thing we do is have a little sit down team meeting. And Dave, you'll appreciate this coming from, you retiring as a commander. So obviously, you have these homicides, and maybe the commander or the assistant chief shows up to one of these meetings. I had pretty much the entire command staff, half the Commonwealth Attorney's Office, and the public safety commissioner and mayor in my damn meeting. So
I can tell you all that usually doesn't happen. As a matter of fact, as a commander, one of the first things you learn to do is stay out of everybody's way. Because if we enter the room, our culture really it's like E.F. Hutton. Nobody talks. So God bless you. I'm glad you survived that.
Do you think that was contributed to who he was?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Because that's not a normal everyday thing to have all these people breathing down your back, is it?
No, I mean that, we obviously we wanted the prosecutor's office there so I could walk them through what I had and what they wanted. That didn't surprise me. And even a commander or the assistant chief of investigations wouldn't have surprised me. But, the fact that it was pretty much the entire staff that held the public safety commissioner at that time, when we never see that guy. And and the mayor, of all people, the mayor sitting in my meeting.
I can say, because this is important too, because people listen to these podcasts because they're interested in how this stuff works. But I'm going to say this. Those huddles in that bay are probably repeated all over the country. I'm sure it happens the same way. And I can remember when I was there, are some of the most amazing teamwork meetings I've ever seen in my life, where there's a complete, everybody's got a high degree of humility. They pick a case apart. It's one of the healthiest things I've ever seen. And I can tell you now, to be a fly on the wall in one of those is actually remarkable to watch. But yeah, I think what people need to understand is that usually in our business, the supervision runs out front and tries to run interference on all those political media things so that the detectives can stay on the case. But yeah, I never had a meeting that had that kind of heaviness in it. So you did pretty good.
So really at this time, we had this meeting, we kind of run through everything. We talk about the DVO. And one of the things that at this time we kind of had to do was Amanda's current boyfriend. We had to get a hold of him and rule him out as a suspect. Sure enough, when we go interview him, he also owns a .38 Special Smith & Wesson nose revolver. So now we've got a priority of, oh gosh, she's got the same gun too. Again, the wonderful people at the Kentucky State Police Central Forensics Laboratory arms examiners bent over backwards to make sure that we could get that gun examined. And they were able to conclusively say that wasn't the weapon, which was fantastic. One of the things in our meeting that the Commonwealth Attorney said is put him in Fayette County, because we had all these old pieces. We had the video that showed a car very similar to the one that was located at the cemetery, basically his daughter's car. We had no witnesses at the townhomes. Nobody saw anything. They just heard the gunshots, heard Amanda screaming, and then more gunshots. And a lot of it was, that they were scared that, they heard gunshots. They hit the floor. They took cover. So they didn't look out the window. And I don't blame anybody for that. And, that's somewhat unusual in that area of downtown to have gunshots at 6:30 in the morning. So obviously it scared a lot of people. We tried via phone records and cell tower information to put him in Fayette County. We were able to determine that he made his last usage of his phone at 11:30 p.m. on September 10th, and he didn't turn his phone back on until 8:39 a.m. on the morning of the 9th, or the morning of September 11th. So we can't use cell tower information to put him in Fayette County. So we end up doing a search warrant for his financial records and looking at his bank cards and his credit cards. We discover that at 6:50 a.m., he used a credit card to purchase gas at a Chevron station located on Purcell's Road, US 60, just outside Fayette County in Woodford County. And the reason this is significant is this gas station is at the intersection with the Bluegrass Parkway in Central Kentucky, and you take the Bluegrass Parkway to get towards Glasgow, Barron County, Bowling Green. Within really less than 15 minutes after the homicide, he's made it to this Chevron station to get gas. And at that point in time, I was like, I got him in the county. So at that point in time, I felt that I had probable cause. I typed up what I had at that point in time, presented to a judge, and they issued a arrest warrant for him for murder and violation of a protection order.
Wow. So yeah, and you're right there at that exit, nearing as you approach BG Parkway. That's certainly ample enough time to get from where that occurred. It's certainly at 6:50 in the morning. Not a lot of traffic, but so I'm thinking at that point he's probably headed down to the cemetery to make law enforcement at least think he's going to commit suicide. Do you feel his reason for going down there?
Oh, absolutely. I feel it was, well, let me qualify that by saying this. I don't think his intent was to kill himself. I think his intent was to get law enforcement to kill him, to commit suicide by cop. His wounds were superficial. He loves him, as I learned through this investigation, he loves himself way too much to kill himself. I think his intention was to step out of that tree line with that gun in the hand and the state police shoot him.
Well, and certainly he's lucky that didn't happen, since he actually discharged it as he stepped out of that tree line.
Sure. And talking to the troopers that were on scene at that point in time, the gun, it happened, number one, pretty quick, but number two, it really wasn't even pointed at any of them. or Mr. Nunn. They said he kind of pointed it out to the side and then cranked around, like out to the side and towards the ground and cranked around off. It is amazing that, and then he immediately drops the gun and starts flopping around on the ground. So, honestly, I don't really know if the police had time to shoot him, to be honest with you.
When you talked about him being in our lawmaking body with Kentucky, was there anything that he had done in his time in that service that was related to domestic violence or criminal behavior or anything that you're aware of?
Dave, I'm glad you asked that question. Here's the most ironic piece of this whole investigation. When Mr. Nunn was a state representative, he was a co-sponsor on a bill that made the murder of a victim who had a domestic violence order against their perpetrator a capital offense in the state of Kentucky.
And what's capital mean?
It's a death penalty offense. And that's one of in Kentucky, there's a number of qualifiers to meet a capital offense statute to seek the death penalty for a prosecutor. In 1998, he co-sponsored this legislation that made a violation of a domestic violence order resulting in death a capital offense.
He went right on out and did what he was trying to make a law to prohibit.
Correct.
How's that for irony?
Yeah. In 2007, he publicly backed Democrat Steve Beshear for governor. Governor Beshear ended up winning that election and placed Mr. Nunn on his transition team and gave him a sweetheart job as the Deputy Secretary of the Cabinet for Health and Family Services within the state of Kentucky.
Okay, you got to dig on that. This is just full of irony and craziness. Yeah. What do they do in that cabinet?
Well, one of their primary responsibilities is domestic violence. So he's in charge of these programs to help victims of domestic violence and get get legislators to make better laws for domestic violence victims. And he's the number 2 guy in that cabinet in the state of Kentucky.
And he's the number 1 guy in this case doing exactly what he's trying to help prevent for the rest of the Commonwealth.
Correct.
Hey, there's more to the story, so go download the next episode like the true crime fan that you are.
The Murder Police podcast is hosted by Wendy and David Lyons and was created to honor the lives of crime victims so their names are never forgotten. This podcast is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lyons. The Murder Police podcast can be found on your favorite Apple or Android podcast platform, as well as at murderpolicepodcast.com, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe for more and give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or wherever you download your podcast from. And please tell your friends. Lock it down, Judy.